The dust rose in slow golden spirals over the Wyoming plains as the truck came to a stop beside a long stretch of wooden corrals. The women inside blinked against the sunlight, thin, uniformed, and silent. They were Japanese POWs, captured nurses and auxiliaries shipped across the Pacific to this unlikely place, a cattle ranch turned prison camp. Waiting for them were cowboys, broad-shouldered men in sweat-darkened hats, spurs glinting in the light. One of them, a man named Walt, spat into the dirt and pointed toward the barn. "Feed's got to be hauled before sundown." The women looked at one another, bewildered. They had expected soldiers, not ranch hands. Yet within minutes they were handed pitchforks and sacks, their slender arms straining under the weight. By evening their hands blistered, their hair dust-caked. But when the bell rang for supper, they froze again because the cowboys lined up behind them. "Ladies first," Walt said. No one moved. The world had turned upside down. The engines had barely cooled when the order came. "Out! Line up!" The Japanese women stepped from the truck into sunlight so bright it stabbed their eyes. They had expected concrete walls, guard towers, maybe snarling dogs and shouted commands. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of what looked like a cattle ranch. The ground was hard-packed earth, the air thick with the smell of hay, manure, and smoke from a distant cook fire. Beyond the fences stretched rolling hills the color of old brass, dotted with cattle that grazed lazily as if unaware that a war had ever been fought. The women blinked, disoriented. Their uniforms, once crisp, hung in tatters. Some carried satchels, others clutched nothing at all. They had crossed an ocean in silence, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark holds of a transport ship. Each had been told that capture was a stain worse than death, that the Americans would humiliate them, starve them, strip them of their dignity. Yet now, as the wind carried the scent of cut grass instead of gunpowder, their terror gave way to confusion. The journey to this strange place had felt endless, from the Philippines to San Francisco, then by train through plains that seemed to go on forever. Through the narrow windows they had seen children waving, factories humming, towns untouched by bombs. America was too vast, too alive. It was a landscape that mocked their suffering. In their homeland, entire cities had been flattened. Here, white barns stood upright, painted and proud, their roofs gleaming like silver under the sun. Some of the women turned away from the window, ashamed to look at so much order. Others pressed closer, whispering that perhaps the enemy's wealth was proof of their ruthlessness. Still, the sight of endless fields and open sky lodged deep in their minds, an image that refused to fit inside the cage of hatred they had been taught to carry. When the train finally stopped, they were herded into trucks and driven across dirt roads that wound through valleys and hills. Hours later they arrived at the camp, if one could call it that. Barbed wire framed its perimeter, but inside stood wooden barns, corrals, and water towers. Horses snorted in the distance. A windmill turned lazily against the horizon. It was less a prison than a world in between, neither freedom nor captivity, but something suspended between the two. The women exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered that perhaps this was only a trick, a stage before cruelty began. Another whispered that she had seen this kind of land in an American postcard once, back when such images had been used to frighten them. Pictures of cowboys and deserts meant to symbolize savagery. Yet now those same symbols felt strangely peaceful. Their eyes fell on the men approaching them, Americans, but not soldiers as they had imagined. They wore wide-brimmed hats instead of helmets, boots streaked with mud instead of polished leather. Their movements were unhurried, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. One spat tobacco into the dirt, another tipped his hat with a faint grin, and the gesture sent a ripple of unease through the women's ranks. Kindness was not part of their training manuals. These were the supposed barbarians? Their laughter, low and easy, drifted through the dry air. A young woman named Aiko watched one of them remove his gloves, revealing hands rough with calluses. He looked her over briefly, not with cruelty, but with the detached curiosity of a man sizing up a new horse for the pasture. Then he simply nodded and said, "You'll be fine here, ma'am." The title, polite and absurd in this setting, made her heart pound. The women were shown to their quarters, wooden barracks that smelled of cedar and dust. Straw mattresses lined the walls, each with a folded blanket. To them, it felt like a trick. They had slept on concrete floors, in the mud, under tarps. Clean bedding seemed almost sinister. Outside, the cowboys went about their routines with practiced ease, driving trucks, loading hay, tending to animals. Their banter filled the camp like a soundtrack of normal life, utterly alien to those who had known only the rhythm of war. Aiko stood by the window that first night, staring out at the barbed wire glinting in the fading light. The wire should have made her feel trapped, but instead it looked almost ornamental, like the thin outline of a cage drawn across a vast, indifferent sky. For the first time since her capture, she felt the faint stir of something she could not name. It was not hope, not yet. It was disbelief softening into wonder. The next morning, a bell rang across the camp. A cowboy's voice called out in English, the words slow and heavy, but the meaning clear enough. Work was waiting. The women stepped outside, the dew still wet on the grass, the mountains pink in the dawn. Ahead of them stood the same men from yesterday, their faces hidden by the shade of their hats. One of them smiled faintly and pointed toward the barn. "Feed's got to be hauled before sundown." The women stared, uncertain, and so began the strangest chapter of their captivity, a life measured not by chains or commands, but by the rhythm of the plains. The morning light spilled across the ranch like molten gold, glinting off tin roofs and the slow sway of the windmill. The Japanese women lined up outside the barn, their shadows long and thin in the dust. A cowboy named Walt stood before them, thumbs hooked in his belt, explaining something in English they could barely understand, but his tone, steady, patient, spoke clearly enough. He pointed to a row of burlap sacks piled high, each stamped with black letters, "Cattle feed." The women hesitated. It was hard labor, yes, but not the cruelty they had braced for. One woman, her name lost to history, took the first step forward. She bent, lifted, and staggered under the weight. The others followed, their movements jerky at first, uncoordinated. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the dirt until it shimmered. Within minutes, the air filled with the sounds of labored breathing, rustling cloth, and the faint rhythm of work being learned from scratch. The women's confusion deepened with every passing hour. They had been taught that punishment was the enemy's language. Where were the shouts, the blows, the sneers? When one stumbled, she expected a rifle butt or mockery, but instead the nearest cowboy reached out, steadying her with one hand. "Easy there," he murmured, almost kindly. The words rolled past her, uncomprehending, but the tone made her chest tighten. She lifted the sack again. The repetition became hypnotic. Bend, lift, carry, drop. The feed dust clung to their skin, mixing with sweat until their faces turned gray with grime. But there was something almost honest about it. Work was work. It hurt, but it did not humiliate. By midday, the sun was a white eye staring down without mercy. The women's uniforms, already frayed, were soaked through with sweat. Aiko felt her arms tremble as she hoisted another sack. She had fainted once, months ago in the Philippines, and been beaten for it. Now, as her knees buckled, she waited for anger. None came. Instead, a shadow fell over her. It was Walt again, his voice calm as he set down his own load beside her. He reached for his canteen and held it out. She froze. Water, offered from an enemy's hand. Her training screamed against it. He tilted his head slightly as if to say, "Go on." Slowly, she took it. The water was warm, tasting faintly of metal and dust, but it slid down her throat like salvation. When she handed the canteen back, their eyes met, just for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the first fracture in the wall of fear. The cowboys worked alongside the women, their movements smooth and economical. They rarely barked orders. Instead, they led by example. "Use your legs," one said, demonstrating the motion with a sack slung over his shoulder. "Don't fight it. Flow with it." The words meant little, but his gestures spoke volumes. Slowly, the women began to mimic their rhythm. The rough work turned almost graceful, like a dance done in silence. Aiko noticed how the men spoke to one another without cruelty, teasing lightly, trading jokes she couldn't understand but could feel through their laughter. Even when a woman dropped her load and cursed under her breath in Japanese, the cowboys laughed, not mockingly, but with amusement. One of them even repeated the strange word she'd said, mangling it completely, and she found herself laughing too. It startled her, that sound. Laughter in captivity felt like a crime. By late afternoon, the air shimmered with heat. Dust rose in clouds, turning every figure into a moving blur. The women's backs ached, their hands raw, but there was a rhythm now, a strange peace in repetition. A cowboy passed by, wiping sweat from his brow. He paused beside Aiko and tipped his hat. "Good work," he said simply, before walking on. She didn't understand the words, but she knew the meaning. She stood a little straighter. Around her the others did too. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day, the women staggered back toward the barracks, legs trembling, hearts thudding. They had expected torment and found exhaustion instead. The difference was dizzying. Behind them the cowboys gathered their tools, their laughter rising again in the warm air. For the first time the women did not hear it as mockery. It sounded like something else entirely. Normal life, unbroken by war. As Aiko washed her hands in the tin basin outside the barracks, the sun dipped low, staining the sky red. She glanced at the horizon, where the cowboys were still moving among the corrals, silhouetted against the light. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. This was not mercy, not pity. It was respect, the kind earned through shared sweat. And as the smell of supper drifted from the mess hall, she realized that what she feared most now was not cruelty, but kindness. The bell clanged through the fading light, sharp and metallic, cutting through the hum of crickets and lowing cattle. The Japanese women froze mid-step, uncertain whether the sound meant assembly or punishment. But then they saw the cowboys putting away tools, washing their hands at the trough, wiping their brows with their sleeves. The men moved toward the long wooden tables set outside the mess hall, where steam rose from metal pots and the scent of beef stew hung thick in the evening air. The women's stomachs clenched at once, an involuntary ache that made their knees weak. They had been living for weeks on rationed bread, thin soup, and fear. Hunger was an old enemy, one that dulled pride. Yet tonight, pride refused to bow easily. Aiko stood among the women, her face streaked with dust, her hair clinging to her neck. Her body begged for food, but her mind whispered warnings. To accept kindness from the enemy was to betray everything she'd been taught. Behind her, someone muttered a prayer in Japanese. Another turned away, ashamed of her own hunger. The cowboys noticed their hesitation. Walt, the same man who had offered her water that morning, looked at the group for a long moment, then stepped forward. He removed his hat, held it at his side, and said something in English, slow and steady. None of the women understood all the words, but the meaning came through when he pointed toward the tables and gestured for them to move ahead. "You worked same as us," he said, the faintest smile on his face. "You eat first." No one moved. The women looked at one another as though waiting for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself. Surely this was a trick, a test of obedience, a prelude to mockery. One woman, older than the rest, shook her head sharply, refusing to step forward, but Aiko felt something else rising within her, something that wasn't defiance, but disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. Slowly, as if walking into a dream, she took a single step. The gravel crunched beneath her boots. The cowboys did not stop her. Then another woman followed, and another, until all of them were moving toward the tables. The sight was almost surreal, prisoners being invited to sit first, while their guards stood waiting behind them. The women lowered themselves onto the benches, stiff-backed, hands in their laps. The aroma of stew was overpowering, meat, onions, pepper, and the faint sweetness of corn. It was a smell that spoke of homes they'd lost, of warmth they no longer believed they deserved. When the first bowl was passed down the line, the women hesitated again. Aiko's hand trembled as she lifted her spoon. The stew was thick, heavy, and impossibly rich. She brought it to her lips and paused, her throat tightening. Around her, the others did the same, each tasting with disbelief that bordered on fear. Then, slowly, the silence broke. Not with words, but with the sound of spoons scraping against metal bowls. Hunger triumphed over pride. For the first time since capture, they ate not as prisoners, but as human beings. Walt and the others stood back, leaning on posts or sitting cross-legged in the dirt, waiting until every woman had eaten before taking their share. The gesture was quiet, unspoken, but it hit the women harder than any kindness could. It was dignity, a gift so rare in war it felt almost unbearable. As the sun slipped below the horizon, lanterns were lit along the tables. The light flickered across faces still wary, still searching for malice. But none came. A cowboy nearby, barely older than the women themselves, laughed softly when one of them accidentally slurped too loudly. The sound startled her, and for a heartbeat she nearly dropped her spoon. Then she realized he was laughing with her, not at her. Something inside cracked open, fragile as porcelain. She laughed back, shyly, and the others followed, the sound small, but real. For a few minutes the camp felt less like a prison and more like a forgotten corner of peace. The cowboys talked quietly among themselves, their voices low and warm. The women ate until the ache in their bellies softened into calm. In that strange twilight, the war seemed to pause, held back by something as simple as shared food. When the meal ended, Walt stood again and tipped his hat, a gesture now familiar but still bewildering. "Tomorrow's another day," he said, and his tone carried neither command nor threat, just weary respect. The women rose slowly, their legs heavy, and began to drift back toward the barracks. Aiko looked over her shoulder once, watching the cowboys sit down to eat their share, only after the women had left. She couldn't explain why it mattered so much, but she knew it did. In the darkness, Under a sky spangled with stars, she whispered to no one, "The enemy waits until we are fed." And though her words were quiet, the truth of them would echo for years to come. The days began to blend into one another, each marked by the same rising sun, the same creak of barn doors, the same steady rhythm of boots on dirt. The women awoke before dawn now, not because they were ordered to, but because it felt right. The cold air bit their skin as they washed in tin basins, and the sky above them stretched endlessly, pale and merciless. Yet somewhere between exhaustion and routine, they began to find a strange kind of peace. The work that had once felt like punishment had become a language, a way to measure their worth without fear of humiliation. Walt and the other cowboys never shouted, never raised their voices, yet the rules were clear and absolute. You worked hard, you showed respect, and you kept your word. That was the code of the plains, and it needed no translation. At first, the women tried to resist the rhythm of that life. Pride had been drilled into them as armor, obedience as survival, but the ranch demanded something different. It asked for effort, not submission. When they faltered, there were no beatings, no jeers, only the quiet expectation that they would stand back up. Aiko learned this one morning when a sack tore open in her hands, spilling feed across the ground. She fell to her knees instinctively, muttering apologies, bracing for anger. Instead, Walt knelt beside her and began scooping the feed back into the sack, wordlessly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When she looked up, confused, he simply nodded once and said, "Happens to everybody." It was the first lesson she learned about these men. Respect was not something they took by force, it was something they offered freely and expected to be returned in kind. The women began to mirror the cowboys in small, almost invisible ways. They learned to tie ropes with calloused fingers, to mend broken fences with quiet determination. When one fell behind, another stepped in without being asked. It was not kindness. It was code. Each day's labor became a silent promise to one another that they would not yield to weakness, not because they were prisoners, but because they were workers now. There was dignity in sweat. There was strength in endurance. The cowboys' philosophy seeped into them slowly, like water into dry earth. It was a creed built on action, not words. A man's word was his bond. His honesty was his armor. "You lie once," Walt told them one evening, speaking to no one in particular, "and it'll hang around your neck forever." The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the weight in his voice. Later, when a small tool went missing, one of the women, young, terrified, admitted she had borrowed it and forgotten to return it. Walt didn't punish her. He only looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You told the truth. That's what matters." The next day she worked harder than anyone else in the camp. There were no written laws on the ranch, no guards patrolling with rifles, no ranks or medals. Yet order held. When a woman bowed to thank a cowboy for handing her a tool, he tipped his hat in return, a gesture she soon came to recognize as equal in weight. Bows met with nods. Silence met with patience. Even laughter had its own language. One afternoon, when a sudden gust of wind blew hay into everyone's faces, the entire group, cowboys and captives alike, burst into laughter. It was wild and unguarded, carried away by the wind across the endless plains. The women started to realize that the cowboys' world was bound not by fences, but by honor. It was a land where a man's strength came from restraint, where authority was not shouted but shown. The simplicity of it unsettled them at first. They had grown up under commands, their loyalty measured by obedience. Yet here, loyalty was measured by trust, and trust was something earned in the quiet moments. when someone shared water without asking, when a back was turned without fear. At night, as the wind howled across the open fields, Aiko would sit outside the barracks, watching the faint glow of lanterns from the bunkhouse. She thought of home, of the rigid order that had shaped her life, of the lessons about honor that had led her into war. And she thought of these men, rough, unrefined, smelling of tobacco and leather, who somehow embodied that same honor more purely than anyone she had ever known. For the first time, she began to understand that dignity did not require cruelty. Authority did not need to be feared. In the stillness of the prairie night, beneath the vast American sky, the truth settled over her like dust. The code of the plains was not written on paper or shouted through ranks. It was carried in the heart, and it could not be broken. When the order came that they could finally write home, the women gathered in the mess hall as if summoned to judgment. A wooden crate filled with paper, pencils, and envelopes sat on the table. The room was silent, except for the creak of chairs and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. For the first time in months, they were allowed to address their families, their superiors, their homeland. Yet the gift felt heavy, almost cruel. Each woman stared at the blank sheet before her, paralyzed by the question that hovered like a shadow over every line. What could they possibly say? Aiko held her pencil but didn't write. Her fingers trembled as she thought of her mother in Nagasaki, her father who had served in the Navy, her brothers still somewhere on the battlefield. They had all been taught the same creed, that capture was worse than death, that to live under the mercy of an enemy was dishonor beyond redemption. And yet here she was, alive because of that enemy's kindness. They had fed her, clothed her, even shown her respect. Gratitude welled in her chest like a forbidden emotion, shameful and tender. If she wrote the truth, her family would never forgive her. If she lied, she would betray what she now knew to be real. Around her, the other women wrestled with the same torment. Some bent their heads low, writing quickly, as if afraid the paper might accuse them. Others stared into space, their pencils unmoving. One woman, Yumi, whispered to no one in particular, "How do you write about kindness when you were raised to hate it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. The first letters began to take shape, written in careful Japanese script. They were filled with polite phrases, formal as prayers. "We are alive. We are being treated fairly. Do not worry." But beneath those words lay unspoken truths. Nights spent laughing beside campfires, the taste of real coffee, the strange safety that came from a man's quiet respect. Some tried to disguise these truths as riddles or coded phrases. "The grass here is tall," one woman wrote, meaning, "they let us breathe." Another wrote, "The men do not shout," meaning, "they do not beat us." Aiko simply wrote, "The wind here feels honest," and hoped her mother would understand. Yet the more they wrote, the heavier the guilt became. Each sentence felt like a confession. To speak well of their captors was to betray their nation. To condemn them falsely was to betray themselves. They were trapped in the narrow space between loyalty and truth, and neither offered comfort. When Walt passed through the mess hall, collecting finished letters, his usual easy smile faltered at the sight of so many tear-streaked faces. He hesitated, tipping his hat in quiet respect before leaving the room. That night, Aiko could not sleep. The ranch was still, the cattle murmuring softly in their pens. She lay on her bunk, clutching the letter she had written but not handed in. The words inside it seemed to pulse with heat, as though they could burn through the paper. She thought of her mother reading it, how she might imagine cruelty, filth, starvation. To tell her otherwise would be unthinkable. And yet, Aiko realized, to deny the truth would erase something fragile that had been born within her, the belief that compassion could survive even in war. By morning, some of the women tore up their letters. Others left them unfinished. Only a few were handed in, sealed with trembling hands and uncertain hope. Whether they ever reached Japan, no one knew. The censors would read them, strip away any detail that contradicted propaganda, perhaps discard them entirely. The rest would be lost to time, like so many confessions never spoken aloud. As days turned into weeks, the letters became ghosts, unwritten, unread, but deeply felt. The women carried them inside their hearts, folded like fragile paper cranes. The moral dissonance gnawed at them. How could enemies show such decency when their own leaders had condemned them to die rather than surrender? The contradiction grew unbearable. It twisted their pride, hollowed their certainty, and left them wondering whether compassion, too, could wound. Walt once said, "Out here, a man's kindness can be sharper than a knife." At the time, Aiko hadn't understood. Now she did. Kindness stripped away hatred, left nothing to cling to but the raw ache of humanity. It was easier to endure cruelty. It kept the heart armored. Compassion demanded surrender. And that, she realized, was the hardest captivity of all. In the end, she slipped her unfinished letter beneath her pillow, unable to destroy it. It was both confession and proof. Proof that even in war, gentleness could be dangerous. Proof that mercy, once received, could never be forgotten, and though no one would ever read her words, she knew they carried a truth deeper than victory or defeat, that sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't a gun or a whip, but a simple act of care. The next morning the air smelled of dust and sunlight. Aiko rose before the bell, her body still aching from the day before, but her spirit steadier somehow. The cowboys were already in the yard, saddling horses, their movements slow and deliberate. Walt stood beside one, his hat low against the glare, a coil of rope in his hands. When he saw her watching from the barracks door, he gave a slight nod and motioned her over. "Time you learned the ropes," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, half challenge, half invitation. That morning marked the beginning of their lessons. The women, once laborers and captives, were now being taught the trades of the plains, how to tie a rope that would not slip, how to mend a fence so tight the wind couldn't whisper through it. The work demanded precision, patience, and balance, the same virtues they had once been told were feminine weaknesses. But under the unforgiving sun, those qualities became strength. Aiko's hands, once soft and unsteady, hardened with calluses. The rhythm of labor turned her muscles lean, her stance firmer. She found herself no longer counting the hours until rest. Instead, she measured her days by the quiet victories of skill mastered and fear overcome. Walt and the others never mocked their clumsiness. When a knot came loose or a fence post splintered, they simply showed the motion again, slower this time, until the women could mirror it. They didn't lecture, they demonstrated. Their teaching was wordless but clear. Precision was respect. Effort was honor. And the women, who had once bowed under commands, barked like gunfire, began to find freedom in instruction that demanded not obedience, but competence. The horses were the hardest lesson. To the Japanese women, horses were creatures of power and danger, symbols of foreignness itself. When Walt led out a chestnut mare one afternoon and motioned for Aiko to approach, her hands trembled. The animal's breath puffed against her arm, warm and steady. "She's gentle," Walt murmured, though she caught only the tone, not the words. Slowly she reached out and touched the horse's neck. Beneath the glossy coat, she felt the thrum of life. strong, patient, untamed. That day she did not ride. She simply stood beside the mare until her fear quieted into awe. Days later, Walt called her again. This time he showed her how to mount. "Left foot first," he said, demonstrating with exaggerated care. She tried, failed, and nearly tumbled backward, earning a ripple of laughter from the men nearby. But it wasn't cruel laughter. It was the laughter of shared effort, of learning together. She tried again, and again. On the fourth attempt, she found her balance. Sitting tall in the saddle, she felt the animal move beneath her, a living rhythm that demanded trust. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared. For the first time since her capture, she felt taller than her fear. Walt looked up, tipped his hat, and said softly, "There you go." From then on, the yard echoed with sounds once unimaginable in a prison camp. Laughter, teasing, the slap of rope against wood, the soft thud of hooves on earth. The boundaries between captor and captive blurred, replaced by the mutual respect born of shared sweat. The women still wore their tattered uniforms, but they carried themselves differently now. They no longer moved like shadows. They strode with purpose. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Aiko dismounted from her horse and caught her reflection in the metal trough beside the barn. The woman who stared back was sunburned, her hair wind-tangled, her hands scarred, but her eyes were steady. She no longer saw a prisoner. She saw someone tempered by labor, reshaped by endurance. Around her the cowboys were finishing for the day, their laughter drifting lazily through the air. She caught fragments of words, tones she didn't need translated, amusement, approval, something like pride. That night, as she lay on her bunk, her body sore but her heart strangely light, Aiko realized that what had begun as survival had become transformation. The ranch was still surrounded by barbed wire, the war still far from over, but inside those fences she had discovered something that no army could take from her: mastery, dignity, and a sense of belonging that defied reason. And when she closed her eyes, she thought not of fear, but of the mare's heartbeat beneath her hands, the steady rhythm of life that had taught her, at last, that strength could grow quietly, like a seed in foreign soil. The next afternoon began with heat so heavy it pressed on the land like a hand. The sky was a pale, burning gray, the air thick with the scent of dust and rain that had not yet fallen. Even the horses grew restless, stamping and snorting as if they could feel something stirring in the distance. The women were in the yard, stacking hay, when Walt looked up from his work. Far to the west, a dark bruise of cloud was spreading across the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said to no one in particular. The words carried a weight that made everyone pause. By the time the first gust of wind hit, the ranch had changed. The air grew electric, alive with the low growl of thunder. Dust spun through the air, stinging their eyes. The women rushed to secure tools and cover feed, their movements quick and practiced now, learned from months of labor beside the cowboys. But nature had no regard for discipline. Within minutes, the wind howled through the fences, rattling the corrals, and then the sky split open. Rain came down in sheets, turning the hard earth into slick mud. Lightning flashed, white and violent, and in its brief glare, the women saw the fence at the far end of the field give way. A section of barbed wire snapped, and the cattle, startled by the noise and the sudden freedom, bolted into the open prairie. Walt swore under his breath and grabbed his rope. "Let's go!" he shouted, but before he could give orders, the women were already moving. Aiko didn't think. She just ran. The wind tore at her hair, rain stung her face, and her boots slipped on the muddy ground, but she pushed forward. Around her, the other women did the same. chasing the panicked animals through the storm. The cowboys were shouting, but the words were lost in the roar of thunder. They worked side by side, men and women, captors and captives, their shapes blurred by rain and motion. One of the horses reared, terrified, and Iko instinctively grabbed its reins. Walt saw her and moved toward her, ready to take control, but she was already calming the animal, her voice low and steady. He stopped in his tracks, watching. For the first time, he didn't see prisoners. He saw partners. The women didn't wait for orders, didn't shrink from danger. They worked as if the ranch itself belonged to them, their movements fearless, purposeful. Aiko's hair clung to her face, her uniform soaked through, but she didn't falter. Together, they drove the cattle back toward the fence line, forming a moving wall of determination. When one of the smaller cows slipped in the mud, she and Walt lunged at the same time to steady it. Their hands brushed, and in that instant, lightning illuminated the field. A brief, blinding flash that froze them both in the storm's white breath. Neither spoke. There was no need. The world around them was chaos, wind, rain, hooves pounding the earth. But between them, there was something steady, wordless, and unbreakable. Hours seemed to pass in the span of minutes. The fence was half down, the corrals flooded, but the herd was safe. The storm began to ease, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. The rain softened, falling now like forgiveness. The women stood drenched, mud streaking their faces, chests heaving with exhaustion. Walt looked around at them, all of them, and felt something in his chest shift. These were no longer the frightened prisoners who had arrived months ago, clutching at one another for courage. They had become something else, workers, fighters, survivors. Aiko met his eyes through the rain. She didn't bow, and he didn't nod. They simply stood there, two people breathing the same wet air, united by effort, by danger, by something beyond language. Around them, the other cowboys were laughing now, half from relief, half from disbelief. One of them clapped a woman on the shoulder, saying something that made her smile despite the mud in her hair. The boundary between them, drawn once so sharply by war, had blurred into nothing. When the storm finally broke apart and the sky began to clear, the prairie shimmered under a soft silver light. The fences were bent, the ground scarred, but the herd grazed calmly again as if nothing had happened. Walt exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We did it," he murmured. Aiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She smiled faintly, her eyes bright beneath the dripping strands of her hair. That night, when the campfire crackled and steam rose from drying clothes, the women sat among the cowboys without hesitation. No one spoke of captives or guards any more. They were simply people who had weathered a storm together. For the first time since their arrival, Aiko felt truly free, not because the fences had vanished, but because they no longer mattered. The prairie had tested them, and they had endured. And in the echo of thunder, still rolling faintly across the hills, she felt it, the fragile, eternal truth of survival shared. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so deep it seemed the earth itself was catching its breath. The prairie glistened under the fading light, every blade of grass jeweled with rain. The fences leaned but held, and the cattle grazed quietly, their low murmurs soft as prayers. Smoke rose from the campfire near the barracks, curling into the vast, unending sky. The women sat close together at first, still damp, their blankets wrapped tightly around their shoulders. Across the flames, the cowboys gathered too, boots muddy, shirts clinging to their backs, exhaustion etched deep into their faces. But there was laughter now, low and genuine, like thunder remembered in kindness. Aiko sat nearest the fire, her hands extended toward the warmth. The crackle of burning wood felt like a heartbeat. Walt passed her a tin cup, steam curling from its rim. "Coffee," he said simply. She hesitated, glancing at the dark liquid as if it might bite. In her world, coffee had been a rumor, something only foreign soldiers drank. Still, she raised the cup and took a sip. The bitterness startled her, but the heat soothed the chill still clinging to her bones. Around her, the other women tried it too, some grimacing, others laughing softly at the strange taste. The sound of that laughter, unforced, unguarded, made the firelight seem brighter. For the first time, there were no lines drawn between them. The war, the fences, the uniforms, all seemed to fade beneath the vast western sky. The cowboys sat with their knees drawn up, passing around tin plates of beans and bread. The women accepted them without hesitation now. Walt spoke occasionally, his voice calm, explaining the names of constellations that shone above the horizon. Aiko followed his finger as he traced the stars, though she couldn't understand the words. She repeated one softly, fumbling the English syllables, and he chuckled, a sound not of mockery, but of warmth. She smiled back, shy but unafraid. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, thick with the quiet understanding that comes after shared hardship. The fire popped and sighed, the wind whispered through the grass, and the night wrapped around them all like a blanket. Aiko watched the flames flicker and thought of home. In Japan, she had known silence too, but it had been the silence of fear, of restraint. This silence was different. It was the sound of rest earned, of respect shared. As the firelight danced across their faces, one of the younger cowboys began to hum. The melody was slow, uncertain at first, like a memory trying to find its way home. The women looked up, listening. Without quite realizing it, Aiko joined in, humming a tune of her own, one her mother had sung long ago while mending clothes by lamplight. The two melodies wove together awkwardly, then found a rhythm, blending into something new. The sound was strange and beautiful, wordless, yet complete. Walt closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. It didn't matter that no one knew the song's name. It belonged to all of them now. The fire burned lower, its glow reflected in the eyes of every soul gathered there. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the fences, dark and silent except for the whisper of wind through the grass. Somewhere in that vastness, the boundaries of culture, language, and war dissolved into the simplicity of breath and warmth. They were all, for this brief evening, just people who had worked, endured, and survived the same storm. Aiko leaned back, feeling the ache in her muscles fade into something almost like pride. She watched the embers drift upward, glowing for a moment before vanishing into the sky. "Pretty," she murmured, her accent soft but certain. Walt heard her and nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." For a long while no one moved. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, the stars sharp and clear against the black. It was the kind of peace too fragile to name, born not of treaties or victories, but of shared humanity discovered by accident, a peace that could not last, but in that moment felt eternal. When the fire finally dimmed, and the last of the laughter gave way to silence, Aiko lingered. The horizon still glowed faintly from the storm that had passed. She knew the world beyond this ranch was still at war, still cruel and divided. Yet here, beneath this sky and beside these men, she had glimpsed something larger than survival, something simple and sacred. She closed her eyes and let the silence settle once more, feeling its rhythm match her own heartbeat. The war would continue, nations would rise and fall, but this moment, this fragile calm between enemies, would live inside her like a secret she would never dare to write. The next morning dawned strange and still. The air held a quiet that felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The women rose as they always did, washing in the chill of dawn, tying their hair back, preparing for the day's labor. But the cowboys were different. They spoke in hushed tones, voices low and uncertain. A radio crackled from inside the mess hall, its static whisper cutting through the usual morning sounds of boots and animals. Iko noticed Walt standing beside it, his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the small machine as if it were speaking the voice of God. She couldn't understand the English words, but she saw the shift ripple through the men, the bowed heads, the solemn stillness. One of them turned away, murmuring, "It's over." By mid-morning, the rumor had spread across the ranch like smoke. Japan had surrendered. The war, the thing that had shaped every breath, every prayer, every horror, was finished. But the word "finished" felt wrong. To the women it did not mean peace. It meant something harder to name. When Walt approached them, he didn't speak right away. His usual calm seemed heavier now, his eyes distant. Finally, he said only 2 words, his voice gentle. "It's done." The women stared back, blank and unmoving. The syllables meant little to them, but the tone carried weight. Iko felt it first, not relief, but something closer to vertigo. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. Surrender. The word struck her chest like a blade turned inward. Some of the women began to cry, not softly, but with guttural, choking sounds that came from a place beyond reason. Others sat down in the dirt, silent and pale, their hands trembling. Iko couldn't cry. She felt hollow, emptied out. All her life she had been told that surrender was shame, that death was the only honorable escape. Yet she had lived, she had worked, eaten, even laughed, and now she didn't know what that made her. A survivor? A traitor? A ghost? The cowboys said nothing. There were no celebrations, no shouts of victory. Walt simply lowered his hat, his face unreadable, and the others followed suit. They understood, in their own way, that this news carried no joy. One of them brought out the American flag that hung in the mess hall, but he didn't raise it. He folded it carefully and set it aside. The silence between the 2 groups deepened, not awkward, but sacred. Later, the women gathered under the shade of the barn. The heat pressed down, but no one moved. Iko sat among them, staring at her hands. Around her, voices murmured fragments of disbelief. "Our emperor bowed," one whispered. Another shook her head, eyes wide with denial. For women raised in the shadow of Bushido, surrender was unthinkable. It was the collapse of everything they had been built upon. Their pride, their training, their very reason for living, all had been bound to an unbroken loyalty. And now that loyalty had been severed, what remained was an identity in pieces. Walt approached quietly, carrying a jug of water. He placed it near them without a word and stepped back. The gesture, so simple, was almost unbearable. Compassion, again, this time sharper than any cruelty. He could not console them, he knew that, but he could be present. And in that stillness, his respect spoke louder than any speech could have. That evening, the ranch was silent. No one sang, no one hummed by the fire. The horizon burned orange, the sun setting behind the same hills that had once held promise. The war was over, yet the air felt heavier than ever. Iko watched the sky darken, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't untangle. Would they be sent home? Would home still exist? Could they ever explain what had happened here, that the enemy had treated them with dignity, that kindness had undone their hatred more completely than pain ever could? As darkness fell, she found herself standing by the broken section of fence they had repaired after the storm. The wire gleamed faintly in the moonlight, mended but never quite the same. She ran her fingers over it, feeling its roughness, its strength. The world, too, was mended but scarred. Behind her, Walt's voice carried softly through the dark. "You did good work here," he said. She turned, met his gaze, and nodded once. No words could bridge what stood between them, but the silence did not feel empty. The crickets began their chorus, the night settling around them. Somewhere, far beyond the plains, history was being rewritten in newspapers and treaties. But here, in this small, forgotten corner of America, two worlds simply stood side by side in quiet reckoning. The war had ended, but peace, real peace, was still a fragile, unfinished thing. And as Aiko looked up at the endless sky, she understood that surviving was only the beginning of her surrender. The war has ended, but the memory of dignity will never fade. The whistle of the departing train pierced the crisp morning air, mingling with the distant clatter of hooves as the ranch slowly disappeared behind a curtain of dust and sunlight. Aiko pressed the small handkerchief to her chest, inhaling the faint scent of tobacco and hay, and let herself sink into the rhythm of the train, each sway and creak a reminder that the world she was returning to had not yet caught up with the changes within her. Around her, the other women sat in silence, their faces etched with the same mixture of exhaustion and awe, hands calloused from work that had tested every limit of their endurance. They had arrived as prisoners, but they were leaving as something else entirely, something stronger, more whole, tempered in the unexpected kindness of people who had no obligation to care. Gratitude, bitter and sweet, mingled with the ache of leaving behind the place that had redefined them in ways no victory parade could ever capture. Aiko's thoughts drifted back to the early days, when the walls of the ranch had felt as confining as the prison camp from which they had come. She remembered the bitter, questioning stares, the hesitant conversations with the ranch hands, and the way those same hands had eventually guided her through tasks she had once thought impossible. Each gesture of respect, each small act of trust, had been a quiet rebellion against the cruelty of the world they had known. She realized with a mixture of disbelief and awe that it was not the absence of suffering that had transformed her, but the presence of unexpected humanity. Even in the shadow of war, dignity had been extended, and that had left an indelible mark. The landscape stretched out like a painting in motion, golden fields giving way to hills, rivers, and the skeletal remains of towns scarred by the conflict they had endured. Faces pressed to the windows caught glimpses of fences, barns, and the occasional silhouette of a cowboy pausing in the morning sun. In that quiet observation, there was a moment of reckoning, a recognition that the world beyond the train was unchanged, yet they themselves could never return to it unchanged. The kindness they had received was now a permanent lens through which they would view all encounters, a standard of humanity that no cruelty could erase. As the miles slipped past, Aiko thought about freedom and what it truly meant. It was not the mere lifting of chains or the crossing of borders. Freedom had arrived in the quiet gestures, the patient guidance, and the respect that had been offered without expectation. That revelation, she understood, would stay with her far longer than any official declaration or formal homecoming. The real liberation had not been in leaving captivity behind, but in rediscovering what it meant to be treated as a human being, fully and without apology. She clutched the handkerchief again, feeling the texture beneath her fingers, a tangible reminder of the hands that had shaped her present and the dignity that would shape her future. By the time the train rolled into the station of her hometown, the women were silent, not from exhaustion, but from contemplation. They carried within them a quiet pride, the kind that comes from surviving, adapting, and being seen. They had been hardened by loss, but softened by kindness, their memories forever intertwined with a place they had once considered impossible. And as they stepped down onto the platform, each one knew that the world they returned to would never quite be the same, not because it had changed, but because they had. The war had ended, yet the lesson of humanity, once so fragile and unexpected, would follow them for the rest of their lives, a light they could carry through any darkness, a proof that even in the midst of devastation, dignity could endure.